Welcome to Sustaining Outstanding Schools, SOS, a new feature of the NCEA notes developed and presented by the Center for Catholic School Effectiveness in the School of Education, Loyola University, Chicago. SOS is a catchy way of reminding all of us in Catholic schools of the urgency of being able to demonstrate academic excellence in the mission of our faith-based schools. SOS brings together two powerful, research-supported realities. First, effective teaching has a greater impact on student achievement than any other factor. Second, teachers best improve teaching when they work together in regularly scheduled and carefully focused collaborative learning teams. Each installment of SOS will address a current best practice related to teaching effectiveness and will suggest collaborative strategies to implement the practice at the local school level. In this presentation of SOS, the featured strategy is the identification of similarities and differences. The high-yield strategy identified by researchers as having the highest verifiable impact on improved achievement, a gain of 45 percentile points on average. This webcast will focus on identification of similarities and differences through compare and contrast. In the webcast, we will highlight steps to remember when teaching this strategy. We will walk through an example lesson, demonstrate pitfalls to avoid, and suggest some points for further study and collaboration.
Analysis of the research literature indicates that there are multiple ways to conduct the process of identifying similarities and differences. The four instructional strategies that Marzano identified as the most effective in developing these skills are comparing, contrasting, creating metaphors, and creating analogies. For the purposes of this webcast, the strategies of compare and contrast will be highlighted. It wasn't too long ago that we thought young children couldn't engage in this process. We now know that children can engage in this process and do it rather well.
Let's consider the key steps of teaching identification of similarities and differences. It is important to use specific words that signal the process of identification of similarities and differences. Such words as compare, contrast, and attribute will help signal to the learner that the lesson is focused on the process of identification of similarities and differences. By using precise terminology such as this, it assists learners to be more strategic and deliberate in their approach to identification of similarities and differences. By being explicit with this language, learners will pick up these key phrases, which help students become more independent in accomplishing this skill on their own and transferring it to other contexts. Cognitive maps provide a visual framework for learners, guiding them through the process of engaging in this type of thinking. By displaying them throughout the classroom, they serve as reminders of the thinking process. When students identify the opportunity to use the skill of compare and contrast, they might use the cognitive maps to guide them through that process. An example of a cognitive map is located on our website. It presents the essential questions that guide the process of comparing and contrasting. It serves to remind students to approach this task in a systematic rather than a haphazard manner. To help learners skillfully engage in this thinking process, the use of visual tools such as graphic organizers is strongly suggested. By incorporating visual tools into the lesson, students are able to picture and eventually internalize the attributes of similar and different. It helps to make this process more concrete and the thinking more skillful and systematic. An example of the graphic organizer is located on our website. The graphic organizer is divided into two parts, similarities and differences. The center column is devoted to attributes and highlights the importance of labeling this step in order to aid in skillful comparing and contrasting. In this step, teachers analyze the material currently being taught and determine which concepts will lend themselves to the explicit teaching of identification of similarities and differences. By using this approach, teachers will uncover many concepts which they are currently teaching that can incorporate the use of compare and contrast thinking, leading to even more powerful learning for students. When teachers work together to identify these concepts, the results can be even more powerful. A list of samples of concepts that lend themselves to this type of teaching is found on our website. Remember that the goal of this approach is to empower students to identify the significant similarities and differences and to determine the importance of these patterns. The goal is not to complete the graphic organizer like a Venn diagram as an end product. Rather, it is the goal to engage students in rich, critical thinking activities and to enhance the students' ability to engage in this process independently. It is important that students build a level of confidence as they engage in this process so that they can independently transfer these skills to all of their learning and their everyday life.
Let's apply these principles to a classroom example. Prior to conducting the comparison, remind students of the terms compare and contrast and attribute.
Today we are going to compare two items, triangle and pyramid. People often confuse these two shapes and use the terms interchangeably. Let's look at the similarities and differences to determine if they are more alike or different. First, let's review the process of compare and contrast. We will look for some significant similarities between pyramid and triangle. Remember, let's start with the attribute first. For example, we might start with the attribute of shape, and we could say that both are triangular in shape. Next, we might use the attribute of rotation and determine that you can flip both and not change their shape. A note here, for novice or younger thinkers, it might be beneficial to give the attributes first and then look at the similarities. Once students are used to this process, the students will start to produce the attributes on their own. After the significant similarities have been labeled, the discussion turns to differences, remembering for novices that the teacher may need to label the attribute first. For example, let's look at the differences between triangle and pyramid. First, let's look at the attribute of faces. The triangle is different from the pyramid in regards to faces, in that the triangle has one face and the pyramid has four faces. The next attribute may be edges, and then we can extend the discussion to the attributes of angles and then dimension. Notice that with the presentation, there is evidence of a stepwise approach. Focusing on accomplishing this task in a stepwise fashion helps to reduce a scattered approach. The final step is to look at the patterns that seem significant. This is the crux of completing the process of compare and contrast. Again, the emphasis is not on completing the graphic organizer as an end product. Rather, it is to skillfully engage in the process of compare and contrast to identify these significant patterns. For example, we might look at the patterns of similarities and differences to see that although triangles and pyramids have the same shape and can be rotated without changing shape, the triangles are simple shapes that contain three sides and one-dimensional, while pyramids are more complex, three-dimensional shapes. Now let's look at some pitfalls that can occur when teaching identification of similarities and differences through compare and contrast. In the quick-paced world in which teachers live, it is easy to become entrapped in several snares that prevent them from fully engaging in the strategies that are discussed here. Pitfall number 1. In order to save time, it is easy to truncate a discussion by giving students the answers to the questions. It is important that teachers preserve the role of facilitator to assist students through probing questions in revealing the similarities and differences between the concepts that are being taught. Pitfall number 2. By focusing too much on the completion of the graphic organizer, it becomes easy to believe that this is the end product of the lesson rather than the creation of powerful thinking patterns for students. It is critical to remember that the purpose is to help students discover the significant patterns of similarities and differences and the implications of these patterns. Pitfall number 3. It is easy to think that students are absorbing these strategies simply because the teacher uses them. However, it is important that the instruction in identifying similarities and differences is explicit and direct. Explicit use of the vocabulary, compare, contrast, attribute, will help students to internalize these concepts. Purposefully displaying the cognitive maps and graphic organizers in your room will also increase the direct nature of this type of instruction. It is better to keep saying compare and contrast.
Research shows that when teachers use this strategy well and often, students learn and they learn better. Research also shows that the best way for teachers to get better at using effective instructional practices, like identification of similarities and differences, is by working together in learning teams focused specifically on improving teaching and learning. In larger schools, likely teams would be same course teachers in high schools, same grade level teachers in elementary schools. All algebra teachers, for example, or all third grade teachers, or all junior high science teachers. In smaller schools, teams might be composed of grade level clusters, primary, middle, junior high, or subject areas like fine arts or elementary school specials. Working in teams, teachers agree on the essential learning, create lessons and assessments together, discuss strategies, observe each other, and make suggestions for improvement based on student learning results. If you don't have learning teams already established in your school, form working groups of 3 or 4 teams.
After watching the webcast together as a whole faculty or department, discuss the article and support materials. Share examples of how the strategy is currently used by teachers in your school. Be very specific. Make suggestions for how to use the strategy more effectively. In learning teams or small groups, go deeper. Examine the steps and the pitfalls. Clearly identify and agree on one concrete thing you will each do to improve the use of the strategy identification of similarities and differences. Agree to log your actions and set a schedule for observing each other at least once. Arrange with the principal and your department chair to observe as well. At the next team meeting, share observations about using the strategy and its impact on learning. Refine and agree on actions for the next 2 weeks. Share actions taken and observations of impact on student learning at your next faculty meeting. And finally, be sure to celebrate your successes. We here at the Center for Catholic School Effectiveness thank you for your support of your students and your continued dedication to Catholic education.